The harbor alarm was still screaming when I realized the water was the wrong color. I'd been a harbor pilot at Naval Station Norfolk for 19 years, and I knew that channel the way I knew the lines on my own hands. Slate gray in winter, brown after a storm churned the bottom, green gold in the long light of a summer evening when the algae bloomed in the shallows. I'd seen that water in every mood it had. But that morning, the water along Pier 12 had a film on it, a milky sheen that caught the dock lights and threw them back wrong, like the surface had skinned over the way a pot of broth skins over when it sits too long on the stove. It didn't ripple right. The small chop the wind should have raised was flattened under it, dampened as though something had thickened the top inch of the harbor. I was standing at the rail of the tug Resolute with a coffee going cold in my fist, the steam off it long gone, watching that film spread out from the hull of the destroyer Mahan. And the first thing I thought wasn't infection. It was fuel leak, spill, something with a form to fill out and a number to call, something I could file a report about and forget by lunch. Then a sailor came off the Mahan's gangway at a dead sprint, and he wasn't running toward anything. He was running away from his own ship. I'd watched 10,000 sailors come down 10,000 gangways, and there's a rhythm to it, a casual, heavy-footed clatter of men going to chow or going home. This wasn't that. He took the brow 3 steps at a time with his arms pumping and his mouth open, and he hit the bottom, missed the last step, and went down hard on the concrete of the pier. I heard his knees crack against it from 40 feet away, and he didn't get up to check if he was hurt. He didn't even pause. He scrambled, hands and knees, scrabbling at the rough concrete like the ground itself was going to reach up and grab him by the ankle. Behind him, the watch officer at the top of the gangway was just standing there, not helping, not calling out, not moving. His head was tilted at an angle a living neck doesn't hold, canted hard over toward one shoulder, and his arms hung loose at his sides, and even at that distance, in that gray pre-dawn light, there was something about the way he stood that put the hair up on my arms before my mind had any words for it. That was the moment the morning stopped making sense. I want to take a second here, before this goes where it goes, to say thank you to everyone who keeps coming back to sit with these stories. And welcome to you, if this is your first time listening. If grounded survival stories like this are your kind of thing, subscribe and leave a comment so I know you're out there. It genuinely keeps this channel alive. Now let me get back to that pier, because the next 60 seconds were the last time the base belonged to us. My name is Carl Brandt, 53 years old that spring, 26 of them on the water in one form or another, the last 19 guiding ships in and out of the largest naval station on the planet. My job was simple to describe and hard to do. When a warship or a carrier or a fat civilian cargo hull needed to thread the channel between the open Atlantic and the piers of Hampton Roads, I climbed aboard, took the con from the captain, and walked the thing in or out by feel and tide and engine pitch. Captains command their ships everywhere on Earth except here. In my water, they listen to me. A 4-striper with a chest full of ribbons and a ship under him worth $2 billion would stand at my shoulder on the bridge wing and do exactly what I said, because the alternative was the mud, and the mud doesn't care about rank. That was the deal. And it had kept ships off the bottom for the better part of a century. I knew every pier, every bollard, every shoal that wasn't on the chart because it had built up after the last dredge, and the survey boats hadn't caught it yet. I knew the men who tied the lines, and the women who ran the cranes, and the chiefs who pretended they didn't need a pilot right up until the channel narrowed and the wind got on the beam. And suddenly, they were very glad indeed I was standing beside them, I knew which berths fouled their props on the bottom at low water and which ones had a cross set that would carry an inattentive helmsman down onto the camels. 19 years builds a kind of map in you that no GPS carries and no chart prints. A map made of muscle and memory and 10,000 small corrections. That map was about to become the only thing keeping me and 8 other people alive. The morning had started ordinary, which is to say it had started in the dark. I'd come on shift at 0400 to move the Mahan off Pier 12 ahead of a weather window. There was a storm system building off Cape Hatteras, one of those late-season lows that the forecasters had been arguing about for 2 days. And overnight, the staff had made up their minds. They wanted 3 destroyers and an amphibious ship out to sea before the worst of it closed the mouth of the bay. It's counterintuitive to a landsman, but a warship rides out heavy weather far better in open water than tied to a pier, where the swell works into the harbor and slams a hull against the fenders and the camels until the lines part or the welds crack. Out at sea, a ship can turn her bow into it and take the weather on her own terms. At the pier, she's a tethered animal in a storm. So the plan was a sortie. Get the fleet out ahead of the weather. Routine. I'd done a dozen of them. What I didn't know, what nobody on the waterfront knew yet, though I'd piece it together later from scraps of radio and the things Diaz told me in the dark, was that the thing tearing through the base had come in 2 days earlier on a returning ship, a frigate back from a long deployment, 8 months in the Med and the Gulf, cleared by medical at the pier because the symptoms looked like a bad flu working through a crew that had been cooped up together too long in recycled air, fever, confusion, a deep, wet cough. Some of them disoriented enough that they'd been walked to medical by their shipmates. They'd quarantined a handful of the worst cases in the medical center on base. By the time anyone in a white coat understood it wasn't flu, that quarantine ward was already the single worst place on the installation. And the corpsmen and the nurses and the doctors who'd treated those first sailors had finished their shifts and gone home, gone to the galley, gone to the gym, gone to pick their kids up from the child development center, gone to 100 ordinary places where ordinary people breathed the same air. The base held 40-some thousand people on a working day. You do not contain something like that in a city the size of a small town with a quarantine ward and a few good intentions and a clipboard. You just get a 48-hour head start on the dying. But standing on the Resolute at 0500, all I had was a sailor crawling away from his own ship on bleeding hands, and a watch officer with a broken neck who was, impossibly, beginning to walk. I set the coffee down on the console. I remember that with a clarity that almost embarrasses me, given everything that came after. Setting the cup down carefully, square on the flat of the console where it wouldn't slide, like it mattered, like the world hadn't just tilted under me. Habit. You do the small, correct thing when the large thing is too big to hold in your hands. 26 years of not spilling coffee on electronics will do that to a man. Manny, I said. My deckhand, Manny Ruiz, was coiling line on the afterdeck, faking it down in neat figure eights the way he did, his big hands moving without his eyes. 40 years old, built like a fire hydrant, with a barber shop fade and forearms like mooring bits. The best linesman I ever worked with, and the only man on that tug I'd have trusted with my life before that day, let alone after. He'd done 2 tours in the Marines before he ever touched a tug. Infantry. Somewhere hot and bad that he didn't talk about. And he had the kind of stillness in him that meant his brain could go from idle straight to full throttle without passing through panic on the way. Manny, look at the gangway. He looked. He went very still, the coil of line forgotten in his hands. That guy fell, he said slowly, and I could hear him working it the way I was working it. trying to make the picture fit something that made sense. He went down hard. He should be on the deck holding his knee, or somebody should be helping him up. His eyes moved to the top of the brow. And that one, the OOD. Why is he just standing there? The watch officer was at the bottom of the gangway now. I hadn't seen him start down. One moment, he'd been at the top with his head canted over. The next, he was coming down the brow. And he came down it the way a marionette comes down a flight of stairs. All wrong angles and dropped weight. One hand sliding along the rail, not for balance, but because the hand happened to be on the rail, and the body happened to be moving. He reached the bottom and reached the crawling sailor, who had finally gotten to his feet and was backing away across the pier with both hands raised, palms out. I couldn't hear what the sailor was shouting over the harbor alarm, but I could read the shape of it on his mouth, the way you can read a familiar word at a distance. Stop, stop, it's me, man, stop. The watch officer did not stop. He took the sailor by both shoulders, almost gently, the way you'd steady a friend who'd had too much to drink. And then he leaned in and bit into the side of the man's face. And the sound that came across the water then was a sound I've never been able to get out of the back of my skull. It cut clean under the harbor alarm, under the diesel rumble of the Resolute's idling engines, under everything. A wet, tearing scream, high and then suddenly lower, suddenly thick. "Cast off," I said. My voice came out flat and strange, like it belonged to somebody standing behind me. "Manny, cast off now." He was already moving. He'd dropped the coil and he was across the afterdeck before I finished the word. The Resolute was made up to a cleat at the head of Pier 12 with 2 lines, a bow and a stern, the way we always tied when we were standing by for a job, ready to slip in seconds. Manny took the stern line first, flipping the heavy eye clear of the cleat with one practiced rolling motion of his wrist, then turned and ran forward along the side deck for the bow line. That was when I saw the rest of it. The pier wasn't empty anymore. People were coming out of the buildings strung along the waterfront. The squadron offices, the maintenance shops with their roller doors half raised, the long, low galley where the night crew was just finishing breakfast service, and the smell of institutional eggs and burned coffee still hung in the cold air. Some of them were coming out the way the sailor had run, with the whole body committed to it, arms and legs and lungs, running away from something behind them. And some of them were moving the other way, toward the runners, toward each other, with that same broken, hitching, terribly eager gait, the head leading, the feet catching up. Down at the far end, where the carrier piers were and the great gray cliffs of the flat tops blotted out the lightning sky, a klaxon was going that wasn't the harbor alarm. A different pitch, deeper, more urgent. The general quarters alarm on one of the big ships. The bong 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 that means all hands to battle stations. And somewhere a voice on a topside speaker was repeating a phrase, over and over. The words flattened to noise by the half-mile of cold air between us. I'd heard that alarm 1,000 times in drills. I'd never heard it sound like that. Never heard a real edge under it. "Bow's clear," Manny shouted from forward. I eased the throttles ahead, and the Resolute came off the pier. The gap between her steel hull and the concrete face, opening up to 1 foot, 2 feet, 6 feet of milky black water. A man in mechanic's coveralls reached the edge of the pier just as we cleared it and stood there at the very lip with his arms hanging straight down at his sides, watching us go with eyes that didn't track, that didn't follow the boat, that just stared at the place where the boat had been. Not a runner, the other kind. And then he stepped off the edge of the pier into the water without slowing, without bracing, without the flinch every living person has built into them at the edge of a drop. The way you'd walk through an open doorway from one room into the next. He went under the milky surface, and the film closed over the place where he'd gone in. And he didn't come up. I have run that channel 10,000 times. I had never once been afraid of the water under me. The water was the one thing on this whole base I trusted absolutely. The medium I'd worked my whole life, as familiar and safe to me as the floor of my own kitchen. As the Resolute swung her bow out into the stream, and I felt the tide take her under the keel, I looked down at that milky film sliding past the hull, and I understood, in my gut a full second before my head caught up, that whatever this was, it had gotten into the water. And the water was the one thing on this base that touched everything and everyone. Every pier, every hull. The float at the dive locker, the seawall along the housing area, the storm drains, the bilges. All of it connected. All of it one body. I keyed the radio to the harbor control channel, the one that should have had a chief standing watch at Sewell's Point with a board full of ship movements. Sewell's Point, Sewell's Point. This is Resolute. We have a mass casualty situation on the waterfront. Multiple personnel down at Pier 12 requesting. Nothing came back. Not silence. Worse than silence. The channel was open and live and crowded with voices, all of them talking at once, none of them making any sense, layered over each other into a kind of human surf. A man's voice repeating a string of coordinates in a flat, dead monotone. A woman saying, "Don't open it. Do not open the hatch. Do not open it." Her voice climbing each time. Somebody breathing into a hot mic, fast and shallow and close, for 30 full seconds. And then a single cracked word. Help. Then a sound like a hand being dragged slowly down a steel bulkhead. Then the breathing again. I took my thumb off the key, and the noise cut off, and the wheelhouse was suddenly very quiet, except for the engines. Manny had come up off the foredeck and was standing in the wheelhouse doorway with the bowline still coiled in his hands, looking back at the pier we'd just left, at the buildings, at the figures moving on the concrete. "Carl," he said, quietly now. The shout was gone out of him. "What do we do?" And I realized, standing there with the whole base coming apart behind us, that for the first time in 19 years, I did not have the answer ready in my mouth. My entire job, my entire identity on this water, was knowing how to bring ships in and take them out, knowing exactly what to do at every moment in this harbor. The fleet was supposed to leave port. That was the morning's mission. Get the destroyers and the amphib out to sea ahead of the weather. Nobody was leaving port. The ships weren't going anywhere. And neither, I was starting to understand, were we. The first thing I did was the wrong thing, and I knew it was wrong even as I did it. I steered for open water. Every instinct I had said the same thing the runners' bodies had been saying. Away. Get off the pier. Get into the stream. Put cold, open distance between the Resolute and that thing on the gangway and everything like it. The channel ran southeast from the piers, down past the carrier berths and the long line of destroyer piers, out toward the mouth of the harbor and the wide Chesapeake beyond, and past that eventually, the gray Atlantic. Open ocean. Nothing out there could climb a hull. Nothing out there could come at you from the buildings, because there were no buildings, only water and weather. And I had spent my life learning to handle both. So I pushed the throttles up and let the tug build to her full 11 knots, which on a stubby harbor tug feels something close to flight, the wake standing up white and broad behind us. And we ran down the line of the piers toward the harbor mouth with the whole waterfront unspooling on our port side like a film of the end of the world, frame by frame, pier by pier. It was worse than I'd let myself imagine in those first frozen seconds at Pier 12. The destroyers at the piers we passed were lit up and alive and going nowhere. Their topside lights still burned in the gray dawn. Their radars still turned in slow, indifferent circles. Their flag still stood out stiff in the morning breeze. Gangways were down on most of them, the brows still rigged from the night before. And on most of them, there was something happening at the foot of the gangway that I made myself stop looking at after the second one. On one destroyer, a chief in wash khaki working uniform was standing at the top of the brow with a shotgun, firing down at the pier in a slow, terrible, steady rhythm. Rack and fire, rack and fire. The boom rolling across the water a half-second behind the muzzle flash. And even at that distance, I could see that he was weeping while he did it. His whole face crumpled in on itself. And he did not stop, and he did not slow down. On the next ship, the crew had cut their gangway away entirely, chopped the brow loose and let it fall into the gap. And they were standing in a line at the lifelines along the main deck, watching the pier the way you'd watch floodwater rise toward your front door. They'd made the right call. They'd cut themselves off from the land. But they were trapped on a ship that could not move, because every one of those hulls needed a pilot to leave the pier, and tugs to handle her off the concrete, and line handlers to let go the lines, in a harbor that wasn't on fire to do it in. That was the thing nobody understood yet, the thing that would shape every decision I made for the rest of that day. A warship at the pier is not a car you climb into and turn the key and drive away. It just isn't. The little ones, with luck and a bold captain, might twist themselves off with their own engines if the wind was kind. But the big ones, the carriers and the amphibs and the loaded destroyers, need 3 or 4 tugs just to peel them off the concrete and hold them while they make their turn in the basin. They need line handlers standing on the pier itself to lift the heavy eyes of the mooring lines off the bollards and slack them down so the ship can heave them aboard. And the pier was now the most dangerous square footage on the face of the earth. They need a pilot in the channel who knows the water. The fleet that was supposed to flee to sea was pinned in place by its own enormous size. And the entire fragile infrastructure that moved it, the tugs, the pilots, the line crews, the harbor traffic control, the whole quiet system that made a naval base is actually function, was, right now, in this harbor, me. Me and Manny and one tug, the Resolute. 68 feet of steel and 4,000 horsepower, running scared down a channel full of the dead. I keyed the radio again and switched to the destroyer squadron's working channel, the one the ships used to talk to each other. Any station. This is Harbor Pilot Resolute. I have a tug. I am clear of the piers and underway in the channel. If you have a ship that has power and a crew and you need a tug to peel off the pier, come up on this channel and talk to me. A voice came back almost immediately, so fast it stepped on the end of my transmission. Young, tight, controlled in the way that takes visible effort, the way a man's voice sounds when he's holding himself together with both hands. Resolute, this is Stockdale, Pier 14. We have power, we have steam, we have a crew at stations, but our line handlers on the pier they're gone, sir. The pier crew is gone. We've got the brow up, but we cannot get our own lines off. We're still moored. We're still moored to the pier. Stockdale, can your topside personnel get down to the line handling stations on the pier? Just long enough to lift the eyes off the bollards? A pause. And in that pause I heard, underneath his held-together voice, gunfire. Not the slow, steady rhythm of the weeping chief. A ragged, panicked, scattered clatter. The sound of frightened men shooting at things faster than they could aim. Negative, he said when he came back, and something had gone out of his voice in that pause. Negative. The pier is not... We cannot put anybody onto that pier and get them back, sir. Can you take our lines off from the water? With the tug?" And there it was. The whole shape of the entire morning's problem laid out in a single radio question from a frightened young officer. Mooring lines on a destroyer are as thick as my wrist, sometimes my arm, doubled and tripled up, with great heavy spliced eyes dropped over the bollards on the pier. You take them off from the pier by hand, by lifting that eye up off the iron and walking the line down so the ship can heave it home. From the water, in a tug, with 2 men and a deck barely above the waterline, you cannot reach a bollard 8 feet up on a pier. You cannot lift an eye, you can't reach. It could not be done. Not in time. Not for 1 ship, let alone 30. "Stand by, Stockdale," I said. And I didn't have a standby to give him. I just needed 2 seconds to not say the true thing out loud, which was that there was no way on this earth to get him off that pier with what I had. Manny had been listening from the doorway, his head tilted. He'd put the bowline down on the deck. "Carl," he said, "the ships can cut their own lines." I looked at him. They've got bolt cutters in every repair locker. They've got fire axes on every passageway bulkhead, regulation every 20 feet. They cut the lines at the chock on their own deck, on their own side of the rail. They don't need anybody on the pier at all. Line parts, ships free, current takes her off. He was right, and he was also describing a catastrophe. And I think he knew it even as he said it, because his face changed while the words were still coming out. A 9,000-ton destroyer cut loose with no tug holding her and no pilot conning her is not an escape. It's a battering ram with 300 people inside it. There were close to 30 ships moored in that harbor. If even a dozen of them cut their lines at once with no one in control, they'd drift down on the flood tide and the morning wind and pile into one another and into the bridge piers and into the soft mud of the shoals. And the channel, the one narrow road out of this place, would close, choked with grounded steel, and any chance of anyone ever leaving by water would be gone for good. But the alternative was leaving every one of those crews to be overrun at the pier. 1 mooring line, 1 gangway, 1 open hatch at a time. I keyed the radio. I made a decision that I've replayed more nights than I can count, lying awake with the boat rocking under me, and I still do not know to this day if it was the right one. I'd genuinely like to know what you would have done, standing where I stood with my hand on that key, cut them all loose to save the crews and gamble the whole harbor, or hold them in place and gamble the crews. I made my call. All stations, all stations. This is Harbor Pilot Resolute, and I need every ship in this harbor to listen to me right now. Do not cut your lines. I say again, do not cut your mooring lines. If you set yourselves adrift with no tug and no pilot, you will collide, you will ground, and you will block the channel. And then nobody leaves this harbor, not you, and not anyone behind you. Hold your ships at the pier. Defend your gangways. Cut your brows away if you have to, dog your hatches, but keep your lines fast and keep your ship where she is. I'm going to organize a tug-assisted sortie, and I'm going to take you out one at a time, in order, the right way. Acknowledge and stand by. Resolute out. It was a promise I had no business making, no means to keep, and no real belief in, even as the words left my mouth. 1 tug, 1 pilot, 30 ships. A harbor turning into a slaughterhouse around all of us. But it was the only thing I could say into that radio that would keep those frightened crews from doing the one thing that would kill every single person in the harbor, including the 8 on my own boat. And it gave each of those sealed ships a reason to hold their ground in the dark and wait. A reason to keep their lines on. Hope is a kind of ballast. I'd just handed 30 ships a load of it that I'd made up out of nothing, What I didn't tell them, what I didn't even tell Manny, was that I'd already seen the fatal flaw in my own beautiful plan. To take a ship out, I had to put the tug alongside her. To put the tug alongside her, I had to bring the Resolute in close to the pier. And the pier, and the water at the foot of the pier, the milky, thickened water in the slips, was full of the dead. And the dead, I had already seen with my own eyes, did not all stay down. The man in the coveralls had walked off the edge of Pier 12 and not come up. I'd assumed in the moment that he'd simply drowned, walked into the water like a sleepwalker and sunk. But as I brought the Resolute around in a long, careful turn to come back up the harbor toward Pier 14 and the Stockdale, I throttled back to dead slow because of what I was seeing in the water near the pier faces. There were shapes under the milky film, not floating the way a drowned man floats, face down and slack and given over to the water. Moving. A slow, deliberate, purposeless drift. The way a fish holds itself against a current with small, constant adjustments of its fins, except these were the size of men, and they were just below the surface, hovering. And where the climbing morning light slanted across them at the right angle, I could see pale faces turned up in through the milky water, mouths working, opening and closing, and hands that rose and fell in the slow underwater dark. They weren't drowning. They didn't need to breathe. The water hadn't killed them. The water had taken them in. And the water of that harbor connected every pier to every other pier, every hull to every hull, the dive locker to the carrier basin, to the seawall, to the storm drains. The whole base laced together by a single, continuous body of water that I had spent 19 years of my life thinking of as the safest, most familiar, most knowable thing in my entire world. I'd been afraid of the pier this whole time. I should have been afraid of the channel. I should have been afraid of the thing right under my own keel. The sickness had gotten into the water, and the water touched everything. And I was floating on top of it in a steel boat with a 1/4 inch of plate between us. "They're in the water," Manny said. His voice had gone flat and careful. He'd seen them too. Was leaning over the wing of the bridge looking straight down into the slip. "Carl, they're in the water. They're all in the water. I see them. How are we supposed to get alongside anything? You put the bow into that slip. They're right there on the surface." I didn't answer him because the Stockdale answered for me. Her radio crackled to life. "Resolute, Stockdale. Be advised. We have personnel in the water on our starboard side now, in the slip between us and the pier. And they are, sir, they're climbing. They are coming up the lines. They are coming up our mooring lines out of the water. Hand over hand, they're climbing the lines toward the deck." I looked, and it was true. The Stockdale's mooring lines ran from her deck down at a shallow angle to the bollards on the pier. 4 of them, 6, taut and dripping. And the pale things in the water had found them. They'd found the lines the way a current finds the path of least resistance. And they were climbing them. Not fast, not with any grace or strength or fear, but steadily, hand over slow hand, the line bowing and shedding water under each one. And there were a great many of them, and the lines led straight up and over the rail and onto the ship. Cutting the lines would set the Stockdale loose into the harbor with no control. Not cutting the lines was feeding her crew to the water, one climbing body at a time, up a rope. I'd told them to hold their lines. I'd been on the radio with that order for less than 10 minutes, and it was already getting people killed. "Stockdale," I said. And I kept my voice as steady and flat and certain as I could make it, because a steady voice was the only thing I had left to hand them. And I was not going to let mine shake Cut the lines they're climbing. Just those lines. Cut them at the chock on your own deck and drop the bitter end straight down into the water so they go with it. Keep the lines they haven't reached yet. I am coming alongside your port side, the offshore side, away from the pier and away from the worst of them. And rig me a fire hose over the starboard side, charged, full pressure, and put a man on it. You can't kill them with water, but you can blow them off the lines before they reach the rail. Acknowledge. Cut the climbing lines at the chock, hold the rest. Fire hose on the starboard side. Tug coming alongside to port. Aye, Resolute. A breath. Thank you, sir. I brought the Resolute around the Stockdale's stern, giving the milky water in the slip a wide berth, and came up her port side, the offshore side, the side that faced the open harbor instead of the pier. The film was thinner out here in the open part of the slip, or at least I told myself it was. Told myself the deeper open water held fewer of them. And I needed to believe something. I came alongside slow, the Resolute's big black fenders kissing the destroyer's gray hull with a long groan of compressed rubber, and held her there with a touch of engine. And Manny got a heaving line up to the sailors on the Stockdale's deck, and they bent on, and we made up alongside. And for one moment, one single moment, it felt like a job again. Like work I knew how to do with my hands and my eyes and the throttles. Alongside, made up, the familiar shudder of the tug holding station against a hull. Then the Stockdale's fire hose came on her starboard side, the pier side, and I heard the roar of it and the shouting of the men working it. And over the radio, the bridge said, "Fast now, the control coming apart. It's not enough, sir. It's not they keep coming. We knock 'em off, and they just come again. We've got them on the main deck aft. We've got contacts on the forecastle." And I had to make the next call, and then the one after that. And the morning that was supposed to be a routine pre-storm sortie became the longest day of my life. And I hadn't yet gotten a single ship off a single pier. We did not get the Stockdale off the pier. I want to be honest about that, plainly and up front, because the comfortable lie people tell themselves about days like that one is that there was a plan, and the plan was good, and the plan worked. There was a plan. It almost never worked. What actually happened, hour by hour and ship by ship, was that I learned what that harbor would truly let me do on that particular morning. And it was a great deal less than what I had stood in my wheelhouse and promised 30 crews over the radio. The Stockdale's crew lost the forecastle in about 4 minutes. I watched the clock without meaning to. Pilots watch clocks the way other men breathe. The things that came up the starboard mooring lines and over the bow could be knocked back into the slip by the fire hose, for a while, because the hose threw a man's weight of water in a hard stream. But the hose needed a sailor to hold it and aim it, planting his feet against the reaction of the nozzle. And the sailor holding it could himself be reached. And once one of them got a hand on him, it was finished. Because they did not let go, and they did not tire, and they did not feel the blows. I watched it happen from my wheelhouse 40 feet away, made up alongside, with Manny's line in my deck cleat, and not one single thing I could do to help. The captain, I never met him, never learned his name, only ever knew his voice on the radio going from controlled to fast, to clip to gone. Gave the order to fall back inside the skin of the ship and dog the hatches. A destroyer is a steel box subdivided into smaller steel boxes. Once the heavy watertight hatches are shut and the dogs are thrown, the crew inside is sealed, and nothing on the outside of those hatches is getting through them. Not the dead, not anything. But nothing on the inside is getting out either. And I had already worked out, in the cold back rooms of my head, that the sickness had come aboard the returning frigate as a flu, days ago, quiet and invisible. Sealing the Stockdale's crew inside the skin of their own ship for safety, sealed them in with whatever was already breathing in there beside them. Resolute, the captain said. It was his last transmission, and his voice had gone quiet and even again. The way men's voices go when they have stopped hoping for the thing they were hoping for and have settled instead into doing the next correct thing. We're buttoned up, all hatches dogged, but we've got casualties inside the skin of the ship. Some of the men who came in off the weather decks were bitten before they got below, and we didn't know. We are not a safe ship, pilot. Do you understand me? We are not a safe ship. Whatever you're trying to do out there today, do not send anyone aboard the Stockdale. Not for any reason. Good luck to you. Then he was off the air, and I cast off Manny's line. And we backed away from a 9,000-ton ship full of 300 souls that I could not save and could not move and could not even touch. And I added it to a list in my head that was already getting longer than a man can stand to carry. By 0700, the sun was fully up over the eastern shore, and the harbor was lit clear and gold. And seeing all of it in that clean morning light was almost worse than the half-seeing of the dark had been. Black smoke was rising in 2 columns from somewhere up on the base behind the piers, a fuel fire or a building fire, the smoke leaning over and flattening out across the water in the still morning air, and carrying with it a smell I knew burned diesel. And under it, something else. Something sweetish and thick that I made myself not think about. The general quarters klaxons on 3 or 4 ships had merged into one continuous overlapping wall of alarm that you stopped being able to hear as separate sounds. And the water, all through the harbor now, not just at Pier 12, had taken on that milky skin, the chop flattened under it, and beneath the skin the pale shapes drifted in their slow, patient thousands. And I understood with a fresh, cold clarity that the open channel was no refuge at all. Because the channel was theirs now. Every fathom of it. Manny came up into the wheelhouse with 2 bottles of water from the cooler in the galley below and put one of them into my free hand without a word. His own hands were shaking, just slightly, a fine tremor in the fingers, and he saw me see it, and he didn't bother to hide it or pretend it away. That was Manny. I keep waiting for the cavalry, he said. He cracked his bottle and drank half of it down. Coast Guard, State Police. The Navy's got a whole base full of guns out there. SEALs, Marines, Master-at-Arms, all of it. Somebody's going to get organized and show up and start fixing this. Listen to the radio, I said. He listened. The squadron channel was a babble of cut-off transmissions and dead air and that close, fast breathing. And somewhere under it, all that single repeated word from somewhere. Help, help. That I had stopped being able to hear as a word and had started hearing as just a sound the radio made. The harbor channel was worse, all noise and no voices left in it. And on the emergency net, the channel that should have been the cavalry forming up, there was only a recorded voice, calm and female, and entirely automated, repeating an instruction to shelter in place and await further guidance on a smooth, endless loop, with no living human being anywhere behind it. There's no cavalry, I said. And saying it out loud made it true in a way that thinking it hadn't. Manny, this base is 40,000 people on a working day. Whatever this is, it didn't start at one pier and spread. It went off everywhere at once, this morning, all over the installation, because it was already everywhere, in everybody, just waiting. Anybody who could have been the cavalry is standing on their own pier right now, dealing with their own version of this. Then what are we doing, Carl? It wasn't an accusation, and it wasn't panic. It was a real and honest question from a man who had decided he would follow me into whatever came next and simply wanted to know what the next thing was. What's the job now? I'd been turning the same question over while I conned the tug down the harbor. And somewhere in the last terrible hour, the answer had quietly changed under me without my permission. I had started the morning trying to get the fleet to sea, because that was the mission I'd been given, and that was my whole life's work. But the fleet was not going to sea. The fleet was 30 steel coffins, some of them already full and the rest filling. I could not move them. I could not board them. I could not even safely come alongside most of them. And every single minute I spent trying to do the impossible thing was a minute. The pale things in the water got nearer to the Resolute's hull and the 8 living people now depending on it. The mission had to change, not the fleet. The fleet was already lost the moment the outbreak reached the base, before the ships could leave. The people, anyone still alive and still themselves and reachable from the water without putting the tug into the thick of the slips. That was the job now. Not steel, souls. We're getting people off, I said. Not ships, people. Anybody we can reach from the water without putting the boat where they're thick. We pick our spots careful. We grab who we can grab. And then we get clear of this harbor and down the bay before the channel closes behind us for good. Closes how? You keep saying that. I pointed up the harbor, north, toward the great spans of the bridges and the low, dark mouths of the tunnels that carried the highways across the mouth of Hampton Roads. 2 ways out of this harbor by water, that's it. The main ship channel out to the Chesapeake, and that's wide and deep and clear for now. But if even 2 or 3 of those moored ships break loose or get cut loose and start drifting, they'll ground somewhere in that channel, broadside, and then there's no getting a tug past them, no getting anything past them, ever. And the tide. I checked my watch out of habit, though I already knew. Tide's just about to turn. We've had slack water all morning. That's the only reason things haven't moved. When the flood makes, it's going to push everything that's loose, ships, bodies, the whole milky mess back up into the basin, hard for 6 hours. We've got maybe 4 hours of good water to work in. After that, I cannot promise you the door's still open. Manny took that in, all of it. And then he asked the question I had been quietly steering around for the last hour, the one underneath every other question. And where do we take them? When we get people off, where's there to go? I didn't have a good answer, and I gave him the only honest one I had. Out, down the bay, anywhere that isn't this. There's open anchorages down off the eastern shore, deep water, thin land, marsh and sand, and not much else. There's the open Chesapeake. There's 100 places to put a tug where 40,000 people aren't all turning at the same minute. We figure out exactly where after we figure out who. One problem at a time, Manny. It wasn't a plan. I knew it wasn't a plan. It was a direction, a heading, a bearing to steer. But on a morning when every other thing in the world was collapsing, a heading was enough to make Manny nod once and go forward to break out the spare fenders and rig the boarding net along the low part of the bulwark. And it was enough to keep my own 2 hands steady on the throttles. One problem at a time. The oldest trick there is for staying alive when the whole picture is too big to face. You don't look at the storm. You look at the next wave, and you take it. And then you look at the one after that. The next wave, as it turned out, was a small one. And it nearly killed us all anyway. There was a pier on the south side of the harbor, a little jetty, really, where the harbor security boats berthed the small, fast-armed patrol craft that ran the waterfront and chased off the occasional civilian boater who wandered too close to a warship. Low freeboard. easy water to come alongside in, and set off by itself away from the big crowded slips where the milky water was thickest. And I'd seen movement on it as we came down the harbor. Figures at the end of the jetty, waving. Living movement, the whole body kind, both arms up over the head. The universal language of every shipwreck and every disaster since men first put to sea. We are here. We are alive. Please. I came in on the security jetty, slow and careful, watching the water the whole way in, reading the surface the way I'd read it my whole career, except now I was reading it for the dead instead of for the shoals. The milky film was thinner here too, along the south shore. And I let myself believe the south side was somehow cleaner, somehow safer. The way you let yourself believe small, comforting things when the large facts are unbearable. I was wrong about that. The way I was wrong about a great many things that day. But I didn't know it yet. There were maybe a dozen people gathered at the end of the jetty. Some in the dark uniforms of the base security force, a couple in the camouflage of master-at-arms, and some in plain civilian clothes, and two of them, clinging to the legs of a woman at the very end of the jetty, were children. Small children. On a working naval station, there are families. There's base housing strung along the water, there's a commissary and a chapel, and a child development center where parents drop their kids at 6 in the morning before the duty day. I had not let myself think about that, not once. Not until that exact moment when I saw two small figures pressed against a woman's legs at the end of a jetty. "Manny," I said. "Kids. We've got kids on the jetty." He came up beside me and looked, and his face did something I had never once seen it do in 8 years of working the same boat. The marine stillness, the thing that had carried him through 2 tours of something he never named, cracked clean across the middle just for a second, and underneath it was a 40-year-old man who I knew for a fact had 2 daughters at home across the water in Chesapeake, on the wrong side of everything, and who had been holding the knowledge of where they were and what was probably happening to them down beneath that stillness all morning by sheer dumb force of will. Then the crack closed. The stillness came back over it like the milky film closing over the man in the coveralls. And Manny said, in a voice with nothing in it but work, "Get me alongside. I'll have him aboard in 2 minutes." I put the Resolute's starboard quarter against the jetty, as gentle as I'd ever laid her against anything. And Manny got a line over and made fast fore and aft. And people started coming aboard across the gap. The security officers had it organized, more or less, somebody among them keeping their head, putting the kids across first. The boy first, handed across the 2 feet of black water into Manny's waiting arms, and passed back into the wheelhouse doorway where it was sheltered. Then the little girl, maybe 7, who would not let go of the woman and had to be peeled loose and handed over crying. Then the women. Then the older folks. I stayed at the controls, keeping the tug pinned against the jetty with a steady touch of engine against the current that wanted to walk her off. Watching the water and watching the approach and watching, most of all, the landward end of the jetty, where a chain link gate set into a tall fence separated the security pier from the rest of the base. The gate was where it all went wrong. There were more people coming. I saw them while the boarding was still going on. A knot of maybe 8 or 10 figures came running down the access road from the direction of the base, toward the jetty, running the whole body way, the living way. And behind them, strung out along the road, came more figures the other kind. The hitching broken kind, dozens of them, a loose ragged tide of them, flowing down the same road after the runners, drawn by the movement and the noise. The living runners reached the chain link gate and it was locked, and they hit it and started to climb it. fingers hooked through the links. And one of the security officers still on the jetty broke away and ran up toward the gate to unlock it and let them through. "Don't open it," I said. To no one, because no one on that jetty could possibly have heard me over the engine and the alarms and the shouting. The same words I'd heard a woman screaming on the radio in the first dark minutes of the morning. "Don't open it. Do not open the hatch." And I understood now. Far too late. Exactly what that voice had been trying so hard to stop somebody from doing. He opened it. The living runners came through the gate, and so did the things behind them, because there is no closing a chain-link gate again once there are bodies pressing through the gap, living and dead all tangled together in the opening. The jetty went from an orderly rescue to a churning riot in about 10 seconds flat. People who had a moment before been calmly handing children across a 2-foot gap were suddenly shoving and scrambling and screaming. And the dead were in among them. And Manny had the little girl half aboard and was reaching back across the gap for her mother. And the mother was being dragged backward into the crush by something that had its teeth set in the meat of her shoulder. "Carl!" Manny had the girl aboard, had shoved her into the wheelhouse doorway with the boy, but he was still out on the rail with one arm extended across the gap. And there were people in the water now, people throwing themselves off the jetty to escape the crush behind them. And the pale shapes in the slip were rising up to meet them as they hit the water. And the whole milky surface alongside the jetty was suddenly churning white and pink. "Carl, there's too many. I can't, they're coming down the jetty." I made the call. It cost me everything I had to make it, and it has cost me something new every single day since. There were maybe 20 people still on that jetty, some of them running flat out for the tug, some of them already pulled down and lost in the crush. And I knew with absolute cold certainty that if I held the Resolute against that jetty for one more minute, the dead were going to come aboard, mixed in with the living, and then the tug was gone, and every soul already aboard her was gone, and Manny was gone, and the 2 children pressed into my wheelhouse doorway, were gone. "Cast off!" I shouted it loud enough to tear my throat. "Manny, cast off! Now, we are losing the boat! Cast off!" He looked at me. For half a second he looked at me. And in that half second I watched him take in the whole impossible thing, the people running toward us across the jetty who weren't going to make it across the closing gap, the woman in the water below his outstretched hand, reaching up at him with both arms, the math of it. And then he made his choice, which was to obey me, which was to live, which was to keep the children and the 7 already aboard alive, instead of the 20 he couldn't save. And he flipped the line off the cleat with one furious motion and put his boot against the jetty piling and shoved us off, hard. And I had the throttles already going to full astern. And the Resolute peeled away from the security jetty, with a widening band of black and milky water opening up between her hull and the people who had so nearly been saved. One man made the jump. He saw the gap opening, and he came down the jetty at a sprint and launched himself across the widening water. And he cleared it, barely, hit the Resolute's steel bulwark with his chest and his arms hooked over the top, hanging, his legs in the cold water. And Manny had him by the collar and hauled him bodily aboard. One man, one out of the second group of 20. The rest stood at the lip of the jetty as we backed away or struggled in the churning water, or had already stopped being people at all. And we drew off from them into the open harbor with their voices following us across the widening water. And I've heard those voices every single night for a long time. In the quiet, when the boat is still. We had aboard, when I finally got the Resolute stopped and idling in the clear middle of the harbor and counted heads with my own eyes, 9. 2 children, the boy of about 5 and the girl of about 7. 3 women, a young mother. The girls, separated now from her own children somewhere back in that crush. A stout, middle-aged woman in a galley worker's whites. And a third, older, gray, quiet. A petty officer from the base security force, second class, with a sidearm on her hip and a face like a closed steel door. An older civilian couple, husband and wife, who I'd learned worked in the commissary and had been opening the store for the morning when it started. And the man who'd made the jump, who turned out to be a Navy hospital corpsman, a medic, and who would matter more to all of us than any other person on that boat before the day was finished. 9 out of a base of 40,000. And one of them, though I would not understand it for another hour, had come aboard with the sickness already moving quietly in his blood the slow way, the frigate way, and I had carried it onto my own boat with my own hands and my own decision to cast off and run while I still could. The corpsman was the one who figured it out, because figuring out who was hurt and how badly hurt was his entire trade. And he started doing it the moment the tug stopped and the panic drained out of everyone down into a kind of shaking, hollow quiet. His name was Diaz. Mid-30s, lean with the unhurried economy of movement that good medics have, the kind that comes from years of staying calm with their hands inside other people's emergencies. He moved among the 9 of us in the small, crowded space of the afterdeck, the way medics do. Hands and eyes. Low, calm questions, taking each person in turn. You hurt anywhere? That blood on you, is that yours? Let me see your arms. Look at me a second. He worked his way down the deck, and he got to the man who'd made the jump aboard, not Diaz himself. A different man. A civilian shipyard worker in a torn coverall named Pratt, who'd been caught on the jetty, and Diaz peeled back the torn sleeve of Pratt's coverall to check the arm under it. And he went very still. The same stillness Manny had, the stillness of a brain dropping straight from idle to full power without touching panic in between. There was a bite on Pratt's forearm. 2 clean arcs of broken, ragged skin, unmistakably human teeth, and the skin around the marks was already going dark. A deep, wrong, purple-gray bruising spreading out from the punctures in a way no fresh bruise spreads. Pratt was sweating heavily, gray in the face, and saying he was fine, just shook up, just needed a minute to catch his breath. And Diaz looked up across the deck and found my eyes over the heads of the others. And he didn't have to say one word. I knew. I think everyone on that deck who saw his face knew. The way you know the second you walk into a house that someone has died in it, before anyone tells you anything. I'd seen what the bite did. The watch officer on the Mahan's gangway. The speed of it on the pier, minutes, not hours. And I had carried it aboard my own boat with my own decision, mixed in among the children. The petty officer from security, she'd been quiet since she came aboard, just watching everything with that closed-door face already had her hand resting on the grip of her holstered sidearm. She'd seen the bite. She'd done the same arithmetic I'd done. Off the boat, she said. Flat. No heat in it at all, which was worse than heat would have been. He goes off the boat, now, before he turns and it's all of us. Pratt heard her. Of course he heard her. She was 8 feet away. And he had just watched a dozen people get torn apart on a jetty. He had thrown his own body across 6 feet of open water to live. He had a few minutes of borrowed life left in him. And now the living, the people he'd risked everything to reach, were standing on a steel deck calmly discussing putting him back into the water. He pressed himself back into the corner of the bulwark, and the 2 children were sitting on the deck not 3 feet from him. And he started to beg. And it was the worst sound on a day already built end to end out of bad sounds. Because it was the sound of a man begging for his life, while knowing, in his own gray, sweating face, that the people deciding it were right. I'd want to know something from you here. because I have never once settled it in my own mind, not in all the nights since. A man is bitten. He has minutes, maybe, before he becomes the thing that does the biting. There are two small children on a small boat with nowhere on it to run. What do you do with him? And this is the part that haunts me. What do you owe him? In the few minutes he has left as himself. Hold on to that, because I had about 90 seconds to answer both questions for real. Everybody stop, I said. And I came down out of the wheelhouse, which I almost never do with Way still on the boat. But I'd put her dead in the water, in the open middle of the harbor, and let her drift. Because the next 2 minutes mattered more to me than the channel and the tide and all 30 ships put together. I came down onto the afterdeck, and I put myself, physically, between the petty officer's hand and the man in the corner. Diaz, how long does he have? Diaz was steady, his voice pitched low and even, talking to me, but not only to me. From what I saw up on the base this morning, the fast cases, the bites minutes, but it wasn't the same for everybody, Carl. Some of them took a lot longer. Hours, maybe. I treated the first ones 2 days ago, and they took 2 days. I don't know what decides it. I don't think anybody knows what decides it. He looked at Pratt, and there was no cruelty in his face at all, only a deep tiredness. I'm sorry, man. I'm genuinely sorry. But she's not wrong. We can't have you turn aboard a boat this size with 2 kids on the deck. I'm not going to turn, Pratt said, and his voice cracked on it. I feel okay. I feel I just need to sit down. I just need... And then he stopped talking, because a shudder went through him. A deep one, starting somewhere down at the base of his spine and traveling up through his whole body in a single hard wave. And for half a second, his eyes lost their focus and went somewhere else entirely, and then snapped back wrong, just slightly wrong, the pupils too wide. And every person on that deck saw it happen. And the petty officer drew her weapon, clean and fast, and pointed at the deck, not yet raised. I put my hand up, not at her, not in front of her muzzle, but up, open, at all of them. Not on my deck, I said. Not like this, not with the kids watching it happen 3 feet away. Put it away, petty officer. I mean it. Put it away. Then what? She said, and her voice cracked for the first time since she'd come aboard, the closed steel doors swinging open just an inch on something young and terrified behind it. She was maybe 25 years old. She'd been holding herself together all morning by being hard, by being the one who did the necessary thing. And now the hardness was the only thing keeping her upright, and I was telling her to set it down. What do you want to do, sir? You want to wait until he's got his teeth in one of these kids? You want that to be the thing they see? You want to make me shoot him while he's chewing on a child? Is that better? She was right. That was the unbearable hell of the whole thing. Every single choice available on that deck was wrong, and she was right about all of it. I looked at Pratt. He was holding on to the top of the bulwark now with both hands, white-knuckled, and you could physically see him fighting it, see him holding the door shut against the thing pushing on it from the inside. And he had a few seconds of himself left, and he chose to spend them looking straight at me with a clarity that I have never forgotten. There's a skiff, he said. The words came out thick, like his tongue had gone heavy. I saw it, inflatable, tied off at the security jetty. I saw it when you put me in something that floats, anything that floats, and you cut me loose. I don't go back in the water with them. I don't go off your boat into them. You let me drift off on my own, by myself, away from here. That's all I'm asking you. Don't let it have me where the kids can see it happen. Let me go while I'm still me. We didn't have his skiff? but the Resolute carried a hard-shell life raft canister mounted on the afterdeck, the kind that pops and self-inflates into a sealed orange dome with a canopy. And we had this man's last few seconds, and I made the third terrible decision of that morning. And this is the one out of all of them that I think was right, or at least the very least wrong of all the wrong things I could have done. Manny, pop the raft, float it off on a painter. Manny had it over the side, and the lanyard pulled and the raft inflated in under a minute. The orange dome blooming and snapping taut on the milky water alongside the hull. And then Diaz's training and the corpsman's instinct took over from my orders. And between the three of us, we got Pratt up and over the rail and down into the raft while he could still help us do it. While his arms still worked the way he wanted them to. While he was still Pratt. He lay down in the bottom of the orange dome and he looked up through the open flap at the morning sky. And he said thank you. He said it twice. The second time, so quiet, I barely heard it. And I cut the painter with the deck knife, one stroke. And the current and the morning breeze took the orange dome away from the Resolute's side. Slow at first and then faster, carrying it out across the milky harbor toward the leaning columns of smoke, a single, small, bright spot of orange on all that gray, getting smaller. Nobody on the deck said anything for a long while. The little girl, the 7-year-old, was crying without any sound at all, just tears running down a still face, which is the very worst way a child cries. The young mother had both children gathered against her now, the boy and the girl, her arms around them, her own face pressed into the boy's hair. The petty officer holstered her weapon with hands that weren't quite steady, and she turned away from all of us and put her forehead against the cold steel of the bulwark, and her shoulders shook, once, hard, and then by some act of will I could only admire, she made them stop. Diaz came forward and stood beside me at the rail. We both watched the orange raft drift away and grow small. That was the right call, he said, finally, quietly, just to me. For whatever it's worth to you. You gave him the only thing there was left to give a man in that situation. You let him keep it. It doesn't feel like the right call. No, it never does. And that's exactly how you know you're still a person and not one of them. He said it like a man who'd learned it somewhere hard, long before today, somewhere with sand or with snow in it. He was younger than me by close to 20 years, but he had old eyes. But Carl, and I'm only telling you this because you're the one driving the boat, and you need to know it, that raft just changed everything for the rest of us. The bite is not the only way it moves. I told you. I treated the first sailors 2 days ago, the ones who came off that frigate. Nobody bit those men. They breathed it, or they drank it, or they touched something somebody sick had touched and then touched their own face. It's in the water, you said so yourself, this morning, first thing. It's in the smoke off those fires, maybe, for all I know. And we just took 9 people off a base that was full of it. Every one of us breathing that same air for hours. And any one of us could already be carrying it the slow way. The way it came aboard the frigate. The way it took Pratt's 2 days, not Pratt's 2 minutes. I'd known it. I think I'd known it since I watched the man in coveralls walk off the pier. I'd just refused to take it out and look at it. Diaz was making me take it out and look at it. Any one of us. The slow way. We hadn't escaped the outbreak by getting onto this boat. We had only gotten ourselves onto a smaller, more crowded version of the base, floating on top of the same poisoned water and drifting through the same smoke. And the sickness might already be aboard, quiet and patient, in the blood of someone standing right there on the afterdeck, looking perfectly fine. So, what do you want me to do with that? I said. I don't know yet, Diaz admitted. But I know the boat isn't safe just because it's a boat, and it's got water around it. And I know that if one of us turns the slow way at night, with everybody else asleep on a deck the size of this one, he didn't finish it. He didn't have to. The afterdeck of a tug is maybe 20 feet by 20 feet. There is nowhere on it that is more than a few steps from anywhere else. That was the midpoint of my whole long day. The exact moment the story I'd been telling myself fell completely apart in my hands. I'd been operating all morning on one simple piece of logic, clean and clear. The threat is out there. The pier, the water, the pale things climbing the mooring lines. Get clear of all of it. Get the boat into open water, and you are safe. That was the entire engine I'd been running on since 0500. Get clear, get out, get to open water, and you've won. But the threat was not out there. The threat was potentially right here, in the 9 of us, invisible, riding along on a timer that none of us could read and that might be set for 2 minutes or 2 days. Getting clear of the harbor didn't end it. It only changed it from a fight I could see and steer around into a fight I couldn't see at all, with no warning and no shoals marked on any chart. And there was no pier to cast off from this time, no line to cut, no orange raft to float gently away. You cannot run from the thing if it is already in the boat with you, breathing the same air. I looked around at the 8 survivors on my afterdeck, at the 2 children, at Manny, whom I'd trust with my own life, and the lives of everyone aboard, at the hard-faced young petty officer and the kind, tired corpsman, at the commissary couple sitting close together holding hands the way old married people do without thinking about it. And for the first time all morning, I felt a different fear take hold of me, a colder and more specific one, the fear that would shape everything from here forward. Not the fear of the things in the water, the fear of the people in the boat with me. The smart thing, the thing Diaz had been circling around without ever saying outright, was to set a watch. Not a watch for the things in the water, a watch on each other. To watch for the first sign in one of us. A fever coming up, a vacant look, a shudder from the base of the spine, like Pratt's. And to have decided, ahead of time, in cold blood, what we would do the moment we saw it, where it would happen, who would do it, how, and away from the children. I hated every part of it. But I'd spent 19 years being the man who made the unpopular call because it was the call that kept everyone off the mud. And this was the same brutal job in a far worse coat. Diaz, I said, you're the only one aboard who actually knows what the early signs look like. The real early ones, the slow way ones. I want you to check everybody, quietly, once an hour. Temperature, if you've got any way to take it. Behavior, eyes, balance. And you tell me, only me, the second you see anything at all. And we keep the kids forward, up in the bow, away from the rest of us, with one person we trust completely watching them, and nobody else allowed up there. I looked at Manny. You. Manny held my eyes for a second, then nodded. Slow. And I knew he understood exactly why it was him and not someone else. Because if it ever came down to it, he was the one man aboard I knew for certain would protect those 2 children with his life. And he was also the one man I knew would be able to do the hard thing if the hard thing ever pointed at someone he'd come to like. Both of those at once. That was the whole reason. And we don't tell the others what we're watching for, the petty officer said. She'd come up on my other side without my hearing her, composed again. The closed steel door back in place and locked. With respect, sir, we don't tell them, because the second they know we're sitting here watching them for it, they start watching us back. And then it's 9 people on a boat all staring at each other, waiting to see who twitches first. And that's a panic. And a panic on a deck this size with 1 gun on it kills everybody a whole lot faster than the sickness ever could. She was right. Again. She had a hard, fast, accurate mind under that closed face. And I was deeply glad she was standing on my side of the rail and not someone else's. "What's your name, Petty Officer?" "Okafor, sir. M.A.2 Okafor." "All right, M.A.2 Okafor. We do it your way. Quiet." So we had a plan of a kind. A quiet, ugly, necessary, unspoken plan. Watch our own. And underneath that plan, the real plan, the one I held by myself and told no one. Get this boat and these 8 frightened people out of this harbor and down the bay to somewhere I could put them ashore on land that wasn't already dead, and pray to a God I hadn't talked to in years that none of them turned before I got them there. Because I genuinely did not know, then or now, what I would actually do if one of them began to turn while I watched. I put the Resolute back into gear and brought her bow around toward the harbor mouth, southeast, toward the clean water. And as I did it, the tide, which had been hanging slack all morning, began to turn under the keel. I felt it before I saw any sign of it. A tug pilot feels the tide change through the wheel the way a horseman feels his horse change its mind beneath him. A subtle thing. A shift in how the boat wants to go and how hard you have to work to hold her on her heading. The slack water that had been holding the whole harbor eerily still all morning was gone. And the flood was making, the great slow, patient inhale of the Atlantic Ocean, pushing up the bay and in through the harbor mouth. And everything in that harbor that floated was about to start moving with it. Moving up, moving inward, away from the sea. Away from the only door out. Including, I realized, with a cold drop in my stomach, the ships. Every loose ship. Anything not held fast. I keyed the radio one more time, the squadron channel, and I almost didn't, because I was afraid of what I'd hear or not hear. All stations, all stations. This is Harbor Pilot Resolute. The flood tide is making now. If you are holding at your pier on your lines, double up everything you've got, fore and aft and breast and spring. The current is about to load your lines hard for the next 6 hours. Tend your lines and hold your ships. Acknowledge anyone. A few ships came back, fewer than before. The list in my head of the ones that didn't answer this time was getting longer. The Stockdale didn't answer. I hadn't expected her to. But one destroyer, the Gravely, came up clear and strong and steady, a chief's voice, older, calm. Resolute, Gravely, we copy all. We are doubled up, fore and aft. We're tending our lines, and we are holding. We've got the ship sealed up tight, and we are holding fast. Pilot, are you still planning to come take us out? We've got 310 souls aboard counting on it. I looked at the harbor mouth, at the clean, honest water past it, at the 4 hours I'd promised myself that were already burning down to 2 with the flood making against me. I looked back at my own deck, full of frightened, living people I'd actually managed to save. And I had to choose, one more time, between the promise I'd broadcast to 30 trapped crews in the dark and the 9 real lives already in my 2 hands. Gravely, I said, and I made myself say it plainly because that chief deserved the truth and not more ballast made of nothing. I can't take you out today. I'm sorry. I've got survivors aboard the tug now, and I've got the one boat and the tide's against me and the channel's filling up. Hold your ship, stay sealed, tend your lines, and wait for help that has more boats than I do. Don't drift. Whatever else happens, whatever you hear, do not let go and do not drift. Resolute out. There was a pause on the channel. Then the chief came back, and his calm voice didn't change at all. Understood, Resolute? We'll hold. Good luck to you out there. That was all. No anger, no begging, no breakdown. Just a man accepting a hard fact and going back to the work in front of him. It was almost worse than if he'd cursed me. It was the second promise I'd broken to a ship that morning. And I broke it, because the arithmetic had never actually supported the promise. In the first place, and a man who keeps a promise that gets 9 living people killed isn't honorable. He's just slow at the arithmetic. But the harbor was not finished with me yet, because not every crew had held. Up at the north end of the harbor, where the smoke was thickest and the light came through it brown and strange, a ship had drifted loose. I saw her as I brought the Resolute around toward the channel, a destroyer. Broadside to the current, no lines on her, no tug, swinging slow and ponderous on the flood tide, her great gray length turning broadside across the harbor and coming down toward the mouth of the very channel I needed to use to get my people out. The thing I'd warned every ship in the harbor about, the thing I'd built my whole desperate order around, was happening right in front of me. A loose ship was about to close the channel. And she was going to do it right between the Resolute and the open sea, while the flood tide pushed her down into the exact narrow throat of water that, if she grounded there broadside, would lock every living soul in this harbor inside it, including the 9 on my own deck. I had minutes to decide what to do about it, and exactly 1 tool to decide with. The tug under my feet and the 19 years of knowing this particular water that lived in my hands. A 9,000-ton destroyer drifting broadside on a making flood tide is not a thing a single harbor tug stops. I knew that the way I knew my own name. Every instinct earned over 19 years told me the right and the safe. And the sane thing was to get out ahead of her, to put the throttles down and slip through the closing gap before she sealed it and run for the open bay and save the 9. Let the harbor close behind me like a door swinging shut. I'd done everything 1 tug could do. But if she grounded broadside across that channel, she didn't just trap the ships astern of her. She trapped everyone. Every crew still sealed in every hull, every survivor I hadn't reached on every pier. The Gravely and her 310 souls holding faithfully on their doubled lines right now, because I'd told them help with more boats was coming. If the channel closed, no help was ever coming, not by water, not for any of them, not ever. The drifting ship wouldn't only block my own way out. She'd seal the door on everyone I was leaving behind, and turn every broken promise I'd made that morning into a death sentence I'd personally signed. I could save 9 for certain by running, or I could try to save the bare chance of saving thousands by doing something close to suicidal with 1 tug and 2 men. "Manny," I called down from the wheelhouse. He was already standing at the rail, looking up the harbor at the drifting ship, already reading her, already doing his own math. "That's the Mahan. She's loose." The Mahan. The ship I'd been sent to move at 0500. The ship with the broken-necked watch officer on her gangway. The ship where the whole impossible day had started for me. She'd broken her lines on the flood, or someone aboard her had cut them in a panic before they were lost. And now she was coming down the harbor broadside to finish what she'd started at dawn, to close the door on all of us. "You're thinking about pushing her," Manny said. It wasn't a question. He'd worked alongside me for 8 years, and he knew the way my mind ran. If I can get the tug onto her quarter and put the bow against her and hold it there, I can swing her bow. I don't have to stop her, Manny. I can't stop her. Nobody could. I just have to turn her enough that she grounds along the bank instead of square across the channel, lengthwise instead of broadside. That keeps the door open. With what crew? He turned and looked back at the afterdeck, at the 8 people on it. "You and me, and a deck full of civilians and 2 kids." "You and me," I said. "The civilians go forward and stay forward, up in the bow with Okafor watching them and the kids, and we dog the door behind them. Diaz works the deck with us, 3 of us. That's enough to handle the tug for a push if nothing goes wrong. And if something goes wrong? He said it level, not arguing, just laying the truth on the table where I could see it. If we're alongside that thing, fendered up, holding the push, and they come down onto us off her deck, she's crawling, Carl. I can see them on her main deck from here. There's a lot of them. That was the real risk, and he'd named it exactly. To push a ship, you have to put the tug's bow or shoulder hard against her hull and hold it there under full engine power, fendered in contact for minutes at a stretch. And while we held that contact, the Mahan's low quarterdeck would be only 7 or 8 feet above the Resolute's afterdeck. And the things on the Mahan's deck could simply walk to the edge and step down onto us, the way the man in coveralls had stepped off the pier into the water that morning without a flicker of hesitation. They'd drop right onto my deck while my hands were locked to the throttles. I keyed the radio one more time with almost no hope left in me. Mahan, this is Resolute. Is there anyone alive on your bridge? Anyone at all who can answer this call? Nothing came back. Just the open hiss of the channel. And under it, a faint, to say, that wet dragging sound I'd been hearing on every channel all morning long. Like something heavy being pulled slowly across steel. She was a dead ship, full of the things, drifting on the tide to strangle a whole harbor. And I was about to put my boat against her. I told the 8 survivors what I was going to do, in plain words, because they had a right to know I was about to put their lives on the table. I climbed down and told them, standing on the afterdeck with the Mahan growing slowly larger up the harbor behind me. The commissary couple wanted to run for the open water, the husband saying it out loud, the wife just nodding along. Okafor said flatly that pushing the Mahan was insane, that I had survivors and children aboard, and that I should take the gap while it was open and run. Diaz said nothing at all. He just took off his jacket, folded it once, set it on the engine room cowling, rolled his sleeves up his forearms, and waited. Because he was a man who, once the decision was made by the person whose job it was to make it, gave himself over to it completely. I told them the truth as I saw it. If I run, we live. Maybe, for today. But every crew still holding in this harbor dies, sealed up in the dark inside their ships, because the door closes behind us, and nobody can ever come back through it to get them. The Gravely has 310 people on it doing exactly what I told them to do, holding their lines and waiting for me. I'm not going to buy our 9 lives by drowning their 300. I won't do it. I would rather try this and fail at it. I looked straight at Okafor. But it's a real risk to those kids, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend it isn't. So if you want to argue me out of it, argue now, fast, while there's still time to turn and run. Okafor looked at the 2 children sitting against the bulwark, and at the gray broadside bulk of the drifting ship, and back at me, and the closed steel door of her face opened just a crack, just enough to let one human thing show through it. No, she said. I hate it. I think it's going to get us killed. But no, you're right. If that channel closes, we're all just dead a little later instead of right now. Just... She put her hand flat on top of the boy's head, gently. Don't get us killed for nothing, sir. If you can't turn her, you let go and you run. Promise me that one thing at least. That one. That one I'll keep, I said. And I meant it all the way down. And it was the only promise I made that entire day that I was completely sure I had the power to keep. I put the Resolute up the harbor toward the Mahan, driving against the flood. The tug shouldering her stubby way through the milky water with the pale shapes drifting all around her hull. And I lined up my approach on the destroyer's port quarter, the after corner of her, the spot where a push would lever her bow around and swing it toward the bank. Manny and Diaz rigged the big cylindrical push fenders on the Resolute's bow, the heavy ones we used for laying into a hull. And then they stood ready at the foredeck with boat hooks in their hands, not to fend off, but to knock back anything that came down onto the deck off the Mahan's rail above us. I came in slow. The Mahan loomed up out of the brown smoke light, gray and enormous and wrong, her radars dead and still now, her flag hanging limp, and her decks coming clear as I closed. And the decks were a horror that I will not fully describe, except to say that what had been 300 sailors at dawn was all still aboard her. All of it, in some form, and it moved. As the Resolute's padded bow came up against the destroyer's gray steel hull, and I leaned into the throttles to begin the push, the things on the Mahan's quarterdeck noticed us. Heads turned. Bodies began to drift toward the rail above me. "Contact starboard! They're coming to the rail!" Diaz called out. Steady and clear, the way a good corpsman reads off vitals. "Hold the push," I said. "Manny, keep them off the deck. Just keep them off the deck. I need 90 seconds of solid contact, and she'll start to swing. 90 seconds." I had the Resolute laid against the Mahan's quarter with full power on her. The tug's stern dug down hard into the water, and her propellers churning the milky harbor white astern. 4,000 horsepower pushing against 9,000 tons of dead steel. And through the wheel, and through the soles of my feet, I could feel it, the impossible, enormous mass of the destroyer beginning, just barely beginning, to answer the push. Her bow was coming around, slow as the minute hand of a clock, but coming. And on the afterdeck behind me, the first of them came over the Mahan's rail and dropped the 8 feet onto my deck. It hit the steel hard, the way they all did, with no instinct at all to protect itself, no bracing, no roll, just a dead heavy drop. And Manny was on it before it found its feet, the long boat hook taking it square across the chest and driving it back hard against the bulwark and over the side into the gap between the two hulls. Diaz had the second one the same way, both hands on the shaft of his hook. They were coming down in ones and twos now, dropping the 8 feet off the destroyer's rail onto my afterdeck. And 2 men with boat hooks could hold that line for a while, but not forever. And I needed time I was running out of. And I could not take my hands off the throttles to help them. Because the instant I eased the push, the Mahan would straighten back up on the tide and close the channel, and every bit of this would have been for nothing. "Carl, we can't hold this much longer." Manny's voice strained now. He'd put 2 more over the side, and there were 3 on the deck and more crowding the rail above. Up forward, behind the dogged door, the 7-year-old girl was screaming, a high, thin sound through the steel. "She turning! Tell me she's turning, Carl. Give me something." She was turning. Through the wheel I could feel her bow swinging steadily toward the bank now, toward the soft shoal water along the north shore, where she'd ground lengthwise and leave the channel clear. Another 30 seconds, maybe 40. I watched a thing reach the top of the Mahan's rail directly above my wheelhouse and start to come down toward the wing of the bridge, toward me. And I had a clean choice in that second between letting go of the throttles to defend myself and holding the push and trusting Manny and Diaz to reach me in time. And I held the push, because that was the whole decision of the entire day, distilled down into 1 second, hold or let go, the others or yourself. And I had already chosen, over and over, hours ago, on the Stockdale and on the Jetty, and in the orange raft. And I chose the exact same way, one more time. It came down toward the wheelhouse door, off the Mahan's rail. And Okafor, who was supposed to be forward with the children, who must have come aft against my direct order because she'd seen from the deck What I could not see from the locked forward angle of the wheel, Okafor put 3 rounds into it from the wing of the bridge. Fast and controlled and aimed, the way she'd been trained. The reports flat and hard in the enclosed space. And it folded and dropped into the gap between the hulls and was gone. "Bow's clear of the channel line," I called, watching the Mahan's head swing past the mark in my mind that meant she'd ground clear. "She's going to ground lengthwise. Stand by to back off. Manny, Diaz, clear the deck and get inside the bulwark. I'm letting go in 5-4. The Mahan grounded along the north bank with a long, deep, grinding shudder that I felt come up through the water and into the Resolute's own hull, settling herself lengthwise to the channel exactly where I'd aimed to put her. Her bow run up into the soft shoal, her long gray hull lying like a wall along the bank, but along it, parallel to it, not across the door. The channel stayed open. The harbor stayed reachable. The Gravely and her 310 and every other sealed ship still holding faithfully in the dark, still had a way out for whoever someday came with more boats than I had. I backed the Resolute off the grounded destroyer and out into the clear, deep water of the channel, the gap of black water opening up between us, and Manny and Diaz cleared the last 2 things off the afterdeck and into the harbor. And Okafor came down off the bridge wing white-faced and shaking, holstering her weapon with hands that wouldn't quite obey her. And I did not say one word to her about disobeying my order to stay forward, because her disobeying my order was the entire and only reason I was still alive to give any more orders to anyone. The cost came due that night, the way the real cost always does, after the adrenaline has drained off and left you standing in the quiet with the bill. We made it out of the harbor. I took the Resolute down the channel I'd kept open with the Mahan, past her long grounded hull lying dark along the north bank, past the carrier piers where the great ships sat lit and silent and full of their dead, out through the harbor mouth into the wide, gray-going blue Chesapeake. And as we cleared the mouth, the milky film on the water thinned and broke up, and finally fell away astern, and the bay water went back to honest gray with an honest chop on it. And for the first time since 0500, the boat was not surrounded. I ran her south and east, putting the columns of smoke behind us, steering for the empty anchorages I knew off the eastern shore where the water ran deep, and the land was nothing but a thin, low line of marsh and sand, where 40,000 people were not all turning at once. The flood tide carried us out as much as the engines did, the irony of it not lost on me. The same tide that had set the Mahan loose to close the channel was now helping push us through it to the sea. By dusk, we lay anchored in 8 fathoms off a long spit of marsh grass and pale sand with no lights anywhere on the dark shore, and no sound at all but the small slap of the bay, chop against the hull, and the creak of the anchor rode. The 9 of us 8 survivors and me sat on the afterdeck in the falling dark and didn't talk much, because there was nothing to say that wasn't either too small to bother with or far too large to put into words. Diaz had kept checking us all day, quietly, once an hour, the way I'd asked, a hand to a forehead, a quiet question, a look at the eyes. And around midnight, with the children asleep up forward under a tarp and Manny sitting watch over them, Diaz came aft to where I sat by the wheel in the dark. And he didn't have to say anything at all, because I'd been watching too, and I'd already seen it myself an hour before. The commissary husband, Mr. Holloway, the kind, quiet, gray-haired man who had held his wife's hand all through that endless day. He had a fever. He'd had it for an hour at least, and he'd hidden it from us, sitting very still in the dark with his collar up, the way Pratt had hidden the bruise around the bite, because hiding it was the only mercy left for him to give the rest of us. A little more time before the thing on the boat had a face we knew. He hadn't been bitten. Nobody had touched him with broken skin all day, I'd have known. He'd gotten it the slow way, the frigate way, the way Diaz had warned me about that morning with the orange raft still in sight, breathed it in off the smoke or off the milky water, or carried it aboard on his own hands from the base. And now it was waking up in his blood, in the dark. 12 hours later, exactly as Diaz had said it might. His wife knew. She'd known before any of the rest of us. Of course she had. She'd had her hand in his all day. She was sitting close beside him in the dark, with her arm threaded through his. And when Diaz and I came and crouched down in front of them, she looked up at us. And her eyes caught what little light there was, and she said very quietly, so the wind wouldn't carry it forward to where the children slept, "He wants to go into the water, while he's still himself. He doesn't want either of you to have to be the one to do it." Her voice was steady in the particular way that costs a person absolutely everything they have to keep it steady. "He asked me to ask you, to let him do it himself. I'd floated one man off in an orange raft that morning so he could die alone with some shred of himself intact. And now I was being asked for nearly the same thing again, 12 hours later, by a man who'd had the whole long day to watch what I had let Pratt have, and who had decided, clear-eyed, that he wanted it too. The boat could not carry someone who was turning. Every soul aboard knew it without it being said. The only question left in the dark was whether Holloway walked out the door himself, on his own legs, or whether someone aboard had to put him through it. "You don't have to ask me," I said, and my voice didn't want to work right. "It's not my permission to give him. It's his life. It was always his." Holloway turned his head and looked at me, and he was still himself, all the way himself. Though I could see now in the dim light what it was costing him. See him holding the door shut against the thing, pushing on it from the inside, his jaw working, sweat on his gray face. "I know it's mine," he said. "That's exactly why I'm asking now, while it still is. Because once it's not mine anymore, I don't want anybody on this boat to have to make the decision for me, especially not in front of those 2 kids up there. I've had a good life, son. 41 years married to this woman right here. I'm not going to let the last thing I am in this world be the thing that takes a child off this boat. Let me go now, while I'm still the man who'd never do that. Let me be him at the end." His wife didn't try to stop him. That was the part I could not bear, then or now, the part that comes back to me in the quiet. She didn't beg him or argue or weep and pull at him. She'd done all of that already, I understood. Somewhere in the hours she'd sat there hiding his fever from us, and she'd come out the other side of it into a kind of terrible, exhausted peace. She kissed him. She held his face in both her hands, and she said something to him too low and private for me to hear. And then she let go of his face and let go of his arm, and she let him go. We let down the boarding ladder on the dark seaward side of the boat, the side away from where Manny kept his watch over the sleeping children. Diaz and I helped Holloway to the rail, and he was steady on his feet still, fighting it and winning for just a few more minutes. And he gripped the top of the bulwark and got one leg over and then the other. And he went down the ladder himself, rung by rung, because he didn't want our hands on him at the very end. And I understood that, and let him. He went down into the black water of the bay, the clean water, the honest water, the water that was finally water again. And he pushed off from the cold steel of the hull and swam a few slow strokes out into the dark, away from the boat, away from his wife of 41 years. And then he simply stopped swimming, and the dark water of the Chesapeake took him down, and there was only the small slap of the chop against the hull again, the same as before, as if nothing at all had happened. His wife stood at the rail looking out at the black place on the water where he'd been until there was nothing left there to look at. And then she turned around and walked forward, steady, and laid down near the two sleeping children, because somebody had to be near the children. And she was the kind of person who simply did the next needed thing, even with her whole heart torn out of her chest. And watching her do that, I understood something I have carried ever since. The survivors were not the strong ones, not really. They were the ones who could keep doing the next needed thing after the unbearable thing had already happened to them. That was all survival had ever been. That whole long day. Not strength. Just the capacity to do the next small needed thing. And then the one after that. Diaz checked the rest of us once more before dawn in the gray first light. Nobody else had a fever. 8 of us now, instead of 9. The slow way had taken its one and seemed, for the moment, to be finished with us, though Diaz said quietly that we wouldn't truly know for days yet, that we'd have to go on watching each other for days, which was its own slow poison to have to live with. A watch with no end in sight. I sat up the rest of that night by the wheel, watching the dark line of the marsh shore and the dark moving water. And I did the full arithmetic at last. The arithmetic I'd been putting off all day. I had set out at 0500 to take a fleet to sea. I had not moved one single ship to safety in the whole long day. The 30-some warships of the largest naval station on the face of the earth were all still tied to their piers or grounded in their harbor. Sealed steel coffins full of the dead and a scattered few of the living, holding fast and waiting. The Gravely was still out there in the dark. 310 souls still tending their doubled lines because a voice on the radio had told them help with more boats was coming. I'd kept the channel open for them. That was the one thing I had actually done in 18 hours. I'd kept the door open. Whether anyone would ever come through it with the boats and the people and the will to get those crews out, I had no way at all of knowing. The radio had gone from babble to silence sometime in the evening. And silence, I had learned, was worse than babble. If you've stayed with me this far, sitting in the dark of this story the way I sat in the dark of that bay all night with my hands going cold on the wheel, then I'd want to know one thing from you. Where are you listening from, and is there water near you? A harbor, a river, a lake, a stretch of coast. The kind of water a man can spend his whole life on and come to trust without ever once thinking about it. Because the one hard lesson I carried off that boat, the one that stayed with me when the rest has blurred, is that the thing you trust the most, the thing you know the best, the thing that's kept you safe your entire life. That is exactly the thing most able to turn on you when everything else falls. I'd trusted that water for 19 years. The water was the thing that betrayed all of us. The water carried the sickness from pier to pier and hull to hull. The water filled up with the pale, drifting dead. The water was what the whole fleet was supposed to escape into. And instead, it was the thing the fleet could not even reach. The entire logic of that base, of any naval base anywhere, is that the sea is the way out, that the ships exist to go to sea, that when trouble comes, you get underway, and you put salt water between yourself and it. And the outbreak reached the base before any ship could leave port. And the sea that was supposed to be the escape became the moat that held every soul inside the walled ado, to die. And the thin, fragile, invisible infrastructure that moved the fleet, the tugs, the pilots, the line handlers, the one open channel, that was the single thread the entire thing hung on. And the thread was me. One man on one boat. One thread is not enough to move a fleet. Never was. Was never going to be. At first light I weighed anchor and turned the Resolute's bow south down the bay, hunting for a place to put 7 living people and 1 new widow ashore. Somewhere the world might still be turning the way it was supposed to. Manny stood beside me at the wheel with the sleeping boy's weight against his shoulder, his own 2 daughters on the wrong side of a harbor he could now never go back into. And he didn't say anything. And neither did I. And the bay opened up gray and wide and empty in front of us. I keep the radio on. I've kept it on every day since, every hour, scanning. Sometimes there's a voice. A ship still holding. A crew still sealed in the dark inside their steel box, asking, the way that calm chief asked, whether anyone is ever coming with the boats. I tell them the channel's open. I tell them help is coming. I don't know if any of it is true. It's the same promise I broke twice in a single morning. And I keep on making it to every voice that calls. Because it's the only thing I have that keeps them holding their lines instead of cutting them and drifting. And a crew that holds its lines is a crew that's still alive when the boats finally come. If the boats ever come at all. I kept the door open. That's the one thing I did. Out of everything I tried that day. I just don't know yet, all this time later, whether anyone is ever going to walk through it, or whether I left the largest fleet on Earth holding their lines in the dark, faithful to the end, waiting on a rescue that I knew, even as I promised it to them, might never come at all.